In the early months of 1943, the skies over Europe belonged to chaos. Allied bombers were pushing deeper into enemy territory, and German fighters ruled the air with ruthless precision. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs tore through formations of B-17 and B-24s, their guns blazing, leaving the skies littered with smoke and twisted metal. It was a brutal dance of life and death where altitude, luck, and courage determined who made it home. Into this inferno came a machine that few believed in at first. A fighter too large, too heavy, too unconventional. Yet, this was the aircraft that would change the war in the air forever. They called it the P-47 Thunderbolt, and for those who flew it, it was more than a plane. It was survival. When the first Thunderbolts arrived in England, the pilots were skeptical. It looked nothing like the sleek Spitfires they admired, or the agile Mustangs that would later come to fame. The P-47 was enormous, a brute of metal with thick wings and a round, bulky fuselage that seemed almost comical. But beneath that steel skin was a heart like no other. A massive 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, capable of delivering more than 2,000 horsepower. When it roared to life, the ground shook, and the air itself seemed to tremble. Pilots soon realized that the Thunderbolt wasn't built for beauty. It was built for battle. It was a flying fortress in its own right, armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns that could shred anything in their path, and it could take a beating that would destroy most other planes. The first missions were rough. The Thunderbolt climbed sluggishly and burned fuel like a monster. But once at altitude, it revealed its true nature. It was incredibly stable, fast in a dive, and nearly indestructible. Pilots began testing its limits, and what they found astonished them. The P-47 could dive faster than any other aircraft in the sky. So fast, in fact, that German fighters trying to follow often tore their own wings off. In combat, that meant life or death. When the sky turned deadly, a Thunderbolt pilot could simply roll over and dive out of danger, trusting his machine to hold together as the air screamed past at over 500 miles per hour. For the first time, the hunters became the hunted. The Luftwaffe soon learned to fear the Jug, as the Thunderbolt affectionately came to be called. They mocked it at first, calling it a flying milk bottle, but they stopped laughing when it began tearing their formations apart. The P-47 could dive in from above, unleash a devastating burst of fire, and climb away before the enemy could even react. Those 8 guns spat lead at a rate of over 13 rounds per second, each bullet the size of a man's thumb, capable of ripping through armor and tearing an enemy plane apart in a single pass. German pilots began to whisper about the thunder from the sky, a nickname that would soon become all too real. The American pilots who flew the Jug learned to love it in ways only warriors could love their weapons. It wasn't graceful, but it was loyal. It could take hits that would destroy any other aircraft and still bring its pilot home. Stories began circulating of Thunderbolts limping back to base with holes in their wings the size of basketballs, or with cylinders shot clean off the engine, and yet still flying. One pilot returned with half his tail missing. Another made it back across the channel with his cockpit filled with smoke, hydraulics gone, and his landing gear jammed. But the engine never quit. It became a symbol of survival, of raw, unbreakable will. Life on the airfields of England was a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline. The ground crews worked through the night, covered in oil and grime, patching up bullet holes and refueling the beasts for the next day's missions. Pilots slept in their flight suits, waking to the sound of engines warming up in the cold dawn. Breakfast was often just black coffee and nerves. Before takeoff, there was always a silence, a moment of reflection, a glance at the photo tucked in the cockpit, or a whispered prayer. They knew that once they left the ground, their fate rested with the machine and their own instinct. Flying over enemy territory was like diving into the unknown. Flak exploded around them in black clouds, and the smell of burnt powder filled the cockpit. The intercom buzzed with voices, some calm, some panicked, as formations spread out across the sky. You could see the flashes of sunlight off enemy fighters approaching in the distance, like silver insects glinting in the sun. Then the radio would crackle. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high." And just like that, the calm was gone. The Jug came alive, roaring into a dive, guns thundering. Pilots described the moment when time slowed, when all that existed was the target in their sights, and the vibration of the guns hammering through the wings. Some days were victories, others were massacres. The sky over Europe was littered with fire and falling wreckage. Many young men never came back, their stories lost to the clouds. But for everyone who fell, another took his place, strapping into the cockpit of a Jug and carrying on the fight. That was the spirit of the 8th Air Force, unyielding, defiant, relentless. And at the heart of that spirit was the Thunderbolt, the machine that made survival possible. By the end of 1943, the P-47 had transformed from an untested experiment into one of the most feared aircraft in the world. It had carved its reputation not through elegance or speed, but through brute force and reliability. It was the hammer of the skies, striking again and again until the enemy could no longer rise to meet it. And as the war raged on, the legend of the Jug only grew. It would go on to escort bombers over Berlin, to tear apart tanks in Normandy, and to write its name in the history of victory. But on those first cold mornings in 1943, no one could have imagined that the ungainly metal beast sitting on the runway would become one of the greatest warplanes ever built, a plane that turned thunder into freedom. The year was 1944, and Europe was burning. Every dawn brought a sky filled with wings. Thousands of bombers, silver specks glinting in the sun, escorted by their loyal guardians, the P-47 Thunderbolts. They were the shield that protected the bombers from the deadly claws of the Luftwaffe. Each mission meant hundreds of planes roaring across enemy lines, a thunderous procession that darkened the heavens. The Jug pilots, as they now proudly called themselves, had grown accustomed to the weight of their machines and the power beneath their feet. They had learned its temper, its habits, and its limits. They knew when to dive, when to climb, and when to unleash hell. The air war over Europe had become a brutal ballet of metal, fire, and instinct, and the P-47 was quickly becoming its fiercest performer. The early months of 1944 tested both man and machine. Escorting heavy bombers deep into Germany was no easy task. The missions often lasted 6 hours, through flak, freezing temperatures, and the ever-present threat of German fighters waiting above the clouds. Messerschmitt, Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s would strike in coordinated waves, tearing into the bomber formations like wolves among sheep. The P-47s would dive from high altitude, guns blazing, trying to scatter the attackers before they could reach the bombers. It was chaos. Tracers streaking through the sky, shells bursting, engines screaming. One pilot described it as a sky on fire, where death could come from any direction. Yet even in that madness, the Jug's toughness shone through. Many times, pilots returned home with their aircraft riddled with holes, canopies shattered, hydraulic lines leaking. But the engine, that indomitable R2800, still roared. For the bomber crews, seeing a formation of P-47s above them brought a sense of comfort that words couldn't capture. The Thunderbolt wasn't sleek or beautiful like a Spitfire, but it looked unbreakable, a flying fortress in its own right. When you saw the Jugs overhead, one B-17 pilot said, you felt like you could breathe again. But even as they proved their worth, another problem loomed. The bomber offensives were reaching deeper into German territory, far beyond the Thunderbolt's range. The P-47 simply couldn't stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Pilots often had to turn back while their bomber friends flew on alone, into the heart of enemy airspace. Many of those bombers never returned. The solution would come later, with the arrival of the longer-ranged P-51 Mustang. But before that day arrived, the P-47 pilots were forced to make every minute count. They fought savagely in the time they had, striking hard and vanishing before fuel ran out. By spring, the Thunderbolt's reputation had become legend. German pilots no longer underestimated it. They feared its firepower, its armor, and its ability to dive faster than anything else in the sky. Luftwaffe aces learned that chasing a diving P-47 was suicide. The German planes would simply disintegrate under the strain before catching it. The Americans had turned the Jug's weight into a weapon. They fought on their own terms, using altitude and gravity to crush the enemy. The radio chatter in those days was a mix of chaos and humor. Pilots laughed in the face of death, calling out targets, cracking jokes even as flak burst around them. They were young, many barely 20 years old, yet they flew like veterans hardened by fire. Each mission etched new scars on both their planes and their souls. On the ground, Republic Aviation was working around the clock to refine the Thunderbolt. The engineers listened to every pilot report, every complaint, and every near-death story. They improved the supercharger, redesigned the canopy for better visibility, and added pylons for bombs and rockets. Here, the P-47D model became the workhorse of the U.S. Army Air Forces, capable of escorting bombers, strafing convoys, and pounding enemy fortifications with terrifying accuracy. Pilots began to say that the Jug could do anything. It could fight at 30,000 feet or skim treetops over Normandy. It could tear apart a fighter or annihilate a tank column. It was, as one squadron commander put it, the hammer of God. That hammer would soon fall on occupied Europe. As the Allies prepared for the D-Day invasion, the P-47 became the spearhead of the air campaign. Weeks before the landings, Thunderbolt squadrons attacked railways, bridges, and supply lines across France. They destroyed trains, trucks, and fuel depots, anything that could slow the German response once the invasion began. Flying low, often just a few hundred feet off the ground, Jug pilots strafed columns of enemy vehicles with streams of .50 caliber fire. The sound was deafening, a ripping thunder that echoed through valleys and villages. Civilians who saw them pass overhead said it felt like watching angels of vengeance. But the cost was high. Flying that low meant facing deadly anti-aircraft fire. Flak guns hidden in forests and church towers opened up on them with relentless precision. Many pilots never came back. Those who did often landed their battered planes with shaking hands and eyes that seemed older than their years. June 6, 1944. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history. As dawn broke over Normandy, thousands of ships lined the coast and Allied soldiers stormed the beaches. Above them, the sky belonged to the Thunderbolts. They flew in waves, strafing German gun positions, cutting down reinforcements, and blasting tanks that tried to reach the beaches. One pilot later recalled, "We could see the smoke from the ships and the flashes of artillery below. It felt like the world was ending, yet the Jug held steady. Hour after hour, it returned to base, rearmed, refueled, and took off again." By nightfall, Allied troops had a foothold in France, and the P-47 had played a crucial role in making it happen. As the Allies advanced, the Thunderbolts followed, moving to newly captured airfields in France. From there, they became the nightmare of German logistics. Every train, every convoy, every tank that tried to move by day risked annihilation from above. The Germans called them Jabos, short for Jagdbomber or fighter bomber, and cursed them in every letter home. P-47s prowled the roads, engines screaming, guns flashing. Farmers and villagers would run for cover as the Jugs swooped low, their wings flashing silver in the sun. Sometimes they attacked with rockets. Other times, they dropped 500-pound bombs that shattered bridges and tore up entire intersections. In just a few months, they crippled the German army's ability to move supplies to the front. One American general said, "If it moves, the Jugs will kill it." The pilots became legends. They painted their planes with names like Tallahassee Lassie, Big Ass Bird, and Miss Fire. Nose art became their way of keeping sanity in an insane world. Between missions, they played cards, smoked, and told stories of near misses and impossible escapes. They laughed about the flak bursts that nearly tore off their wings and the dogfights where they saw tracers zip past their canopy. But behind every joke was a shadow. Many of their friends didn't return. Each empty bunk reminded them how fragile life was up there. One pilot wrote in his journal, "We drink hard, fly harder, and pray like hell." By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was crumbling. Fuel shortages, lack of experienced pilots, and the relentless pressure from Allied fighters had taken their toll. But the Germans didn't go quietly. Over the Ardennes in December, during the Battle of the Bulge, the skies turned into chaos once again. The weather was brutal. Low clouds, snow, and freezing rain grounded many aircraft. But when the clouds finally lifted, the Thunderbolts roared back into the fight. They pounded German positions relentlessly, cutting off retreating columns and destroying bridges over the Rhine. Pilots described seeing entire convoys erupt into flames under their guns. "We didn't just fight the Luftwaffe anymore," one said. "We were fighting everything on the ground too." Each mission carried the same ritual. Climb into the cockpit, strap in, feel the rumble of the double wasp beneath your boots, and take off into a sky that might not let you come back. The smell of oil, gunpowder, and fear became part of daily life. Some pilots carried lucky charms, a photo, a coin, a torn playing card tucked in their glove. Others carried nothing at all, saying luck was a luxury they didn't believe in anymore. When they flew, they entered another world, a world of wind, metal, and instinct, where seconds meant life or death. And yet, despite everything, there was a strange beauty in it. The sky was their arena, the jug their companion. It roared when they roared, it bled when they bled, and when they pushed it to its limit, it answered with thunder. By the time 1945 dawned, the Thunderbolt had become a symbol of Allied power. More than 15,000 had been built, serving in every theater of the war. In Europe, in the Pacific, in the Mediterranean, wherever the Allies fought, the jug was there. Its pilots had earned their place in history, and the machine that was once mocked as the flying milk bottle had become one of the deadliest and most respected aircraft of its time. It was not graceful, but it was unstoppable. It was not elegant, but it was eternal. And as the war drew toward its fiery conclusion, the Thunderbolt still had one final chapter to write. The last great battles that would decide the fate of the skies. By the dawn of 1945, the world was on fire, and the P-47 Thunderbolt was right in the heart of the storm. Europe was collapsing. The German war machine, once unstoppable, was staggering under the relentless pounding of Allied bombs and artillery. The Luftwaffe that had once ruled the skies was now a shadow of its former self. Its veteran aces gone, its fuel supplies running dry, and its airfields reduced to smoldering craters. But even as the end drew near, the war was far from over. Every mile toward Berlin was paid for in blood, sweat, and steel, and above that desperate struggle flew the jug, still roaring, still unyielding, still deadly. To the men on the ground, it was the thunder before victory. To the men who flew it, it was a final test of endurance and courage. As the Allies advanced deeper into Germany, the missions grew shorter in distance but longer in danger. The front lines were a tangled mess of shattered towns, frozen rivers, and retreating enemy columns. The Thunderbolts flew low now, often below 1,000 feet, strafing anything that moved on the roads: convoys, trains, tanks, even horse-drawn wagons. The pilots called it the meat grinder. They flew through curtains of flak so thick it looked like you could step out of your plane and walk on it. Every mission felt like rolling dice with death. The sound of anti-aircraft fire rattled through the cockpit. Black bursts filled the sky, shrapnel clinking against the armor plates. Some pilots described it as flying through a storm of angry bees. Yet day after day they went back. "We were killing the German army one truck at a time," one pilot said years later. "And the jug never quit on us." In these final months, the P-47 had evolved into something beyond a fighter. It was now the ultimate ground attack aircraft, feared as much by the Wehrmacht as any tank or artillery battery. With its 8.50 caliber guns, it could chew through armored vehicles like paper. Its ability to carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs meant it could level an entire bridge or factory in a single pass. And when fitted with rockets, those 5-inch monsters slung beneath its wings, the Thunderbolt became a flying artillery battery. Pilots learned to use them with terrifying precision, launching them in volleys that could obliterate tanks or fortifications. German soldiers learned to dive for cover the moment they heard the distant whine of its engine, for the Jug's scream meant death was seconds away. The battles over the Rhine and across the Ruhr Valley showcased the Jug's unmatched versatility. As Allied armies closed in on the heart of Germany, the skies above became a constant hum of thunderbolts. They hunted anything that dared move during daylight. Columns of smoke marked their path across the countryside. One pilot described it as a land of fire and black dust, where every explosion echoed like the end of the world. It was relentless. The Jug had become the embodiment of total war, unstoppable, merciless, and everywhere at once. But for all its might, it was the men behind the controls who gave the machine its soul. Many of them were no longer the fresh-faced boys who had arrived in England 2 years before. They were veterans now, weathered, hardened, and haunted. They had seen friends vanish in flames, had watched parachutes blossom against the sky like white ghosts, had counted the empty bunks after every mission. They had learned to hide fear behind humor and loss behind laughter. In their downtime, they painted more names and pin-up girls on their planes, small reminders of home and humanity. They drank when they could, wrote letters they weren't sure would ever reach anyone, and stared into the night sky wondering how much longer it would go on. The Jug became their only constant companion, the one thing that never betrayed them. Even as Germany crumbled, the Luftwaffe still had one last card to play: the jet. In the winter of 1944, rumors began to spread of a new German fighter, the Messerschmitt Me. 262, powered by twin jet engines and capable of speeds no propeller-driven plane could match. For the first time, the hunters became the hunted. Pilots reported seeing strange, sleek aircraft streaking past them like ghosts. The Thunderbolt couldn't hope to catch one in a straight chase, but its pilots adapted, just as they always had. They learned to hit the jets on takeoff and landing when they were most vulnerable. They dove on their airfields, strafed runways, and ambushed them before they could climb away. The Jug's toughness once again proved vital. Where other fighters might disintegrate under ground fire, the Thunderbolt shrugged off hits and came back for more. As Allied troops closed in on Berlin, Thunderbolt squadrons were flying 3, sometimes 4 missions a day. The end was near, but the danger was greater than ever. German anti-aircraft gunners, desperate and angry, fought with fanatical determination. Entire towns became traps of hidden flak positions. Pilots who had survived years of combat were lost in those final weeks. For the survivors, victory came not with celebration but with exhaustion. When the news finally broke that Germany had surrendered in May 1945, many pilots simply sat beside their aircraft in silence. They looked at the bullet holes patched with tape, the worn paint, the faded nose art, and thought of everyone who wasn't there to see the end. The Jug had brought them home, but at a price that only they could understand. Even as Europe celebrated peace, the Thunderbolt story wasn't over. Half a world away, in the vast expanse of the Pacific, the Jug was still fighting. While the P-51 Mustang had taken center stage over Europe, the P-47 found a second life in the Pacific theater, where its ruggedness and long range made it ideal for the brutal island-hopping campaigns. The heat, humidity, and salt air were merciless on machines, but the Jug endured. From New Guinea to the Philippines, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, it thundered across the Pacific skies. Its job was the same: destroy everything that moved. Japanese convoys, airfields, and fortifications all felt the sting of its guns. Pilots who flew both theaters swore that nothing could match the P-47 for sheer survivability. One said, "If I had to crash land in the jungle, I wanted to do it in a Jug." In the Pacific, missions often lasted over 6 hours, with pilots flying across open ocean to reach their targets. Navigation errors meant death. If the fuel ran low or the engine failed, there was no friendly base to glide toward, only the endless blue of the sea. But the Jug with its massive fuel tanks and dependable engine, gave them a fighting chance. Many pilots owed their lives to its reliability. They pushed it beyond design limits, hauling bombs twice its recommended load, diving through monsoon clouds, pulling out just feet above the waves. It was a machine that forgave mistakes, that carried them home when everything else failed. As the war neared its end, Thunderbolts joined in the final assaults on the Japanese mainland. They bombed railways, factories, and airfields with relentless precision. They strafed trains filled with troops, blasted convoys, and silenced coastal batteries. By the summer of 1945, Japan's skies belonged entirely to the Allies. And when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the war at last, many JUG pilots felt a strange emptiness. The mission they had lived and fought for was suddenly over. They had survived, but their purpose had vanished. The airfields that once shook with the roar of thunderbolts fell silent, and the JUGs themselves, scarred, faded, bullet-pocked, were parked in neat rows, waiting for whatever came next. For many, that next came swiftly. Peace was cruel to war machines. The same governments that had once poured fortunes into building them now saw them as surplus metal. Thousands of Thunderbolts were scrapped, melted down, or left to rust in forgotten airfields. A few were sold to foreign air forces, France, Brazil, Mexico, where they would fly for years more. But most were simply discarded, their glory days over. Pilots watched with heavy hearts as the planes that had carried them through hell were cut apart by torches. Some managed to buy small parts, a control stick, a data plate, a patch of skin from the fuselage, as keepsakes. For them, the JUG was more than an airplane. It was a brother, a memory, a symbol of survival. But history has a way of remembering what truly mattered. Long after the last P-47 left military service, its legend continued to grow. Aviation historians began to look back and realize just how vital it had been to victory. While the Mustang may have won the glamour and the spotlight, it was the Thunderbolt that had done the grinding, brutal work. The low-level attacks, the bomber escorts before long-range tanks existed, the endless days of ground support. It was the aircraft that could take punishment no other could endure. When asked what made the Thunderbolt special, one veteran simply said, "It brought us home." Those 4 words became its epitaph. In time, museums began restoring surviving JUGs, their aluminum skins gleaming once again under hangar lights. At air shows, their engines thundered to life, the same deep growl that once echoed across continents. Crowds watched in awe as the massive fighter took to the air, heavy yet graceful, defying time itself. And when the pilot opened the throttle and the R-2800 roared, it was as if the ghosts of those who flew them were there too, watching, smiling, remembering. Because the Thunderbolt wasn't just an airplane from the past, it was a story of resilience, of courage, and of the men who turned an awkward metal beast into a legend of the skies. And though the war had ended, its echoes remained. In every rumble of thunder across a summer sky, some swear they can still hear the spirit of the JUG. A reminder that strength is not always beautiful, and heroes do not always look the part. The P-47 Thunderbolt had been mocked, doubted, and underestimated. But when the world needed it most, it proved that even the heaviest of burdens can rise higher than anyone ever imagined. Its wings carried not just bombs and bullets, but the hope of a generation fighting to reclaim the light from the darkness. And in the end, the JUG didn't just win battles. It helped save the world. Years after the guns fell silent and the skies cleared, the world moved on. Cities rebuilt, families healed, and nations turned their gaze toward peace and progress. But for the men who had flown the Thunderbolt, the echoes of war never truly faded. They returned home to quiet neighborhoods and ordinary lives, carrying invisible scars and memories that could never be put into words. Some became farmers, teachers, mechanics, and fathers. Others simply drifted, haunted by the roar of an engine that would never leave their minds. At night, when the wind rattled the windows or thunder rolled across the horizon, they would look up and remember. The feeling of the jug trembling beneath their hands, the smell of oil and cordite, the flash of tracers streaking past the canopy. The world called it history. They called it yesterday. In post-war America, aviation entered a new golden age. Jets replaced propellers. Aluminum gave way to swept wings and supersonic speed. The heroes of the past faded from headlines, replaced by test pilots and astronauts. Yet, somewhere in the corner of every airfield, a few P-47s remained. Dusty, oil-stained, silent. Mechanics who had once kept them alive couldn't bring themselves to scrap them. They would run a hand along the battered fuselage, whispering, "You saved more lives than anyone will ever know." And slowly, as years passed, a quiet respect grew around the Thunderbolt. Veterans' reunions brought back the laughter, the stories, and the ghosts. They spoke of dogfights over France, of flak so close it felt like rain, of buddies who never made it home. They'd lift a glass, pause, and say, "To the jug." It wasn't just a toast to a machine. It was to everything it had meant. The legend of the P-47 might have ended there, fading into old photographs and forgotten hangars, if not for the new generation that refused to let it die. In the 1970s and 80s, aviation enthusiasts began searching the world for surviving Thunderbolts. They scoured jungles, swamps, and abandoned airfields from Europe to the Pacific, finding twisted wrecks buried in mud or half swallowed by vines. Piece by piece, they restored them. Every rivet polished, every insignia repainted with care. It took years, sometimes decades, but one by one, the jugs flew again. When their engines finally roared to life, veterans wept openly, their faces lit by fire and memory. "That sound," one said, "I thought I'd never hear it again." The ground trembled as the propeller bit into the air, and the past came alive once more. At air shows, the P-47 quickly became a crowd favorite. Children covered their ears as the big radial engine thundered overhead. Older spectators stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the silver giant carving through the sky. The announcer's voice would echo over the loudspeakers, telling of its armor, its power, its bravery. But the real magic wasn't in the statistics. It was in the feeling. The jug didn't just fly. It carried with it the weight of history, the spirit of a generation that refused to break. Pilots who climbed into the restored cockpits often said the same thing. "It feels alive." And maybe it was. Machines like the Thunderbolt don't truly die. They rest, waiting for someone to remember. In a small museum somewhere in England, an old pilot once stood beside a gleaming P-47 painted in the colors of his wartime squadron. His hair was white now, his hands trembling as he traced the outline of the nose art. Dottie May, named after a girl he once promised to marry. "She waited for me," he whispered, though no one knew if he meant the woman or the plane. He spoke softly to a group of visitors, telling them how he'd flown 92 missions, how he'd watched the flak tear through the sky, how he'd made it home by luck and by the jug's sheer will. When a young boy asked him if he'd been scared, the old man smiled. "Every time," he said. But the jug never was. Across the ocean, in a dusty airfield in the American Midwest, another Thunderbolt sits in the sun, its polished skin reflecting the clouds above. Its logbook is full of names, pilots long gone, mechanics long forgotten. Yet every so often, its engine coughs to life, the great propeller spinning once again. It shakes the earth, rattles windows, and fills the sky with that unmistakable growl. People gather to watch, phones raised, but the sound means something deeper to those who know. It is not just noise, it is remembrance. Every spin of the propeller whispers the names of those who flew, fought, and fell. The jug speaks for them all. Today, only a handful of Thunderbolts remain airworthy, each one a living relic of an age when courage came with a call sign and destiny was measured in altitude. But in museums and private collections, their stories live on. Visitors stop and stare at the massive frame, the thick wings, the battle scars still faintly visible under the paint. They read the plaques and shake their heads in disbelief at the numbers. 8 guns, half a ton of ammo, 2,000 horsepower. Yet what they can't see is what truly made it great, the heart of those who flew it. Because no matter how advanced aviation has become, no jet or drone will ever match the bond between a pilot and a machine that could defy death itself. The legacy of the P-47 stretches far beyond its war record. It became a symbol of endurance, a reminder that strength isn't always about speed or beauty, but about resilience. In a world obsessed with perfection, the Thunderbolt was gloriously imperfect. It was heavy, awkward, and stubborn, but it got the job done every single time. And perhaps that's why it still resonates today, because its story mirrors the human spirit itself. We fall, we break, we rise again. Just like the Jug, built from raw metal and determination, we too find our way through storms. For modern pilots who have had the rare chance to fly a restored P-47, the experience is nothing short of spiritual. They describe it as wrestling with thunder, as if the plane has a pulse of its own. Every control input demands strength. Every maneuver feels like a conversation with history. It doesn't glide. It surges. It doesn't whisper. It roars. And when they land, shutting down the massive engine, there's a moment of silence that feels sacred. The smell of burnt oil lingers. The propeller slows, and time seems to hold its breath. They step out, look back, and realize they've touched a piece of eternity. In documentaries and films, the P-47 often plays second fiddle to the Mustang or the Spitfire, but among the veterans and historians who know, it occupies a special place, a quiet giant, unglamorous but unstoppable. It was the hammer that broke the Reich's back, the guardian that kept bombers alive, the avenger of fallen comrades. It didn't win headlines, it won the war, and that's what makes it legendary. Its pilots didn't seek glory. They sought survival, and in doing so, they became heroes in the truest sense. As time marches on and the last of those pilots fade into memory, their stories become even more precious. Each photograph, each oil-stained flight log, each dented helmet tells a fragment of the greater tale. And though the world has changed, the essence remains. Courage under fire, loyalty to one's comrades, and the will to keep flying no matter how heavy the load. The P-47 stands as a monument to that will. It reminds us that in the darkest moments, when everything seems impossible, there is always strength waiting deep within, sometimes made of flesh and bone, sometimes made of steel and wings. Somewhere tonight, perhaps over the quiet farmlands of Normandy or the rolling hills of England, a restored Thunderbolt cuts through the twilight. Its silver fuselage glows in the setting sun, its wings carving through the clouds with ease. From the ground, people look up in awe, unaware that they are witnessing not just a plane, but a heartbeat from history. Inside the cockpit, the pilot feels the vibration of the great engine, the steady rhythm that once shook the world. He eases back on the stick, climbs toward the fading light, and for a moment, time folds in on itself. The ghosts of the past fly beside him, young men with fearless smiles, their laughter echoing through the clouds. And as the Jug disappears into the horizon, the sky seems to hold its breath once more. The roar fades, leaving only silence and wind. But that silence is not empty. It's full of memory, courage, and gratitude. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the machine that wasn't supposed to work, the plane that carried so many through fire and fear, has earned its rest. Yet its story will never end, because as long as thunder rolls and engines roar, somewhere out there the spirit of the Jug still flies, strong, unbroken, eternal.